Good afternoon. I'm David Chappell. Welcome to this talk on what I would argue is not only one of the most interesting, but one of the most important topics in our world today. The talk is about IT innovation, what it is, and how to get more of it in your organization, whatever your organization might be. So, here's what I want to do. I want to talk first about what IT innovation is. And to do that, I've got two big things I want to discuss with you. The first one is this notion I'll elucidate here of the I3 model, a way that I find useful to think about IT innovation. Second, I want to differentiate between small incremental innovations and conceptual innovations, big shifts, and try to give you some perspective on how you might think about those and perhaps get more of each one. After that, I want to discuss explicitly encouraging IT innovation in IT user organizations and IT creator organizations, because I would argue that they're different. And the way they do innovation, the kinds of things they care about, is also quite different. So that's what we're going to do for the next hour and a quarter. But before we do any of that, let's do something else. Let's talk about a really interesting set of research done by the Wharton School of Business. The Wharton School of Business set out to work with some other people to work out what were the top 30 innovations in the last 30 years, since, say, 1980. Here's the top 10. Number one, you can guess, right? It's the internet, the web, that whole world. Number two, PCs and laptops. Number three, mobile phones. Interesting, I think, to put phones after PCs, but interesting choice. Number four, what do you see? Email. Number five, human genome mapping. You can see, keep walking down here. MRI, microprocessors, fiber optics, office, laparoscopy. What do all 10 of these have in common? Well, the answer is that they're all about IT. Many of them are literally IT. They're software, like numbers 9 and number 4. Number 7 is important because of IT. They're about software, they're about IT. If I were to dig further into the list, the next 20, it doesn't change. They're still mostly predicated on IT. So think what that means. That means that of the top 30 innovations in the last 30 years, according to this organization, most of them and all of the top 10 are based on information technology. The corollary there, the inescapable corollary, I think, is that IT-based innovation is really important to the world we live in. So, let's talk about it. Let's start with this thing I want to call the I3 model. Before I do that, however, I've got to define some terms. And the reason I have to define some terms is that the word innovation is just grossly overloaded. If I asked each of you what innovation means, I suspect your answer would be different. And so let me define for you what I mean here. What I'm talking about this afternoon is something I'd like to refer to as effective IT innovation, which I define like that: a change based on IT that brings value. That brings value. That's really important. The value piece is really important. I would like to suggest that we need to get away from this notion that innovation is all about ideas. A lot of people think of innovation, especially in the technology world, as being deeply and fundamentally about ideas. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think worse than that, it's a pernicious perspective. It's destructive. It makes us get less innovation than we otherwise would. Here's why. First, ideas are critically important. Ideas are the wellspring from which everything else comes. Taking an idea, having a new concept, is fundamental to innovation. But it's nowhere near enough. And so ideas are not even close to the same thing as innovation. Because in my simple I3 model, ideas are just the first I. I number 2 is implementation. Taking this idea, taking this concept, and making it real, making it usable. But even that's not enough. Because I might have an idea that I have implemented successfully, and no one cares. The third step, the third I, is infusion. I must take that implementation, I must infuse it into the world. I must get people to use it. Remember, innovation, a change based on IT that brings value. It is infusion that engenders, that brings about, that creates the ultimate value. This is the simple I3 model I'm going to use throughout this talk. And I think it's a useful way to view innovation, in no small part because it lets us emphasize equally all the things that matter. Some comments about this. First, ideas are overrated. No, let me rephrase that. What I meant to say was, ideas are really overrated. Ideas are unquestionably the sexy part of innovation, are they not? They certainly are. But the reality is, we venerate them, but they're just the first I. Ideas without implementation, without infusion, might be interesting, but they aren't innovations. They don't create value. There are all kinds of examples here. Let me give a very common one. Think about graphical user interfaces, GUIs. Who had the idea for GUIs? Who did the first I? You know, Xerox. Xerox PARC, back in the 70s, invented the notion of a graphical user interface, a GUI. Who got the implementation right? Was it Xerox? Oh, no. Xerox built it into this thing called the Star Workstation. I recall seeing a Star in the early 80s. It was cool. Man, the first GUI, cool. But it was wholly unusable. It was so slow, it was painful. Who got the implementation right? You know that too. Apple, with the Lisa, then the Macintosh. But tell me, who actually made the infusion a global phenomenon? Who was it that made GUIs ubiquitous? It wasn't Apple, because they chose an infusion strategy oriented toward high-priced specialized machines. Who actually made GUIs ubiquitous? Again, you know the answer. It's Microsoft. All three of those pieces were required to create the ultimate value of this innovation. In this case, I would argue, for the broad value of the world, they were all done by different organizations. It's not always true. But the point is to make clear that all three of these things matter, and the idea just wasn't enough. The hard thing about ideas is recognizing when they're really good. It is so difficult to recognize good ideas. I mean, come on. Twitter. Who in their right mind would have thought that Twitter was a good idea when you first heard it described? But it is a good idea. It's a really good idea. Who would know? Recognizing good ideas is hard. One more comment about this simple I3 model. I think the word infusion is better than the more commonly used word here, diffusion. If you are a student of innovation, as some of us try to be, you know that there is a well-known book called The Diffusion of Innovation. Been around for a long time. Good book. But the word diffusion, I think, just isn't right here for two reasons. Reason number one, it starts with a D. I need a word starting with an I for my I3 model. Okay? Reason number two, more important, diffusion is a passive process. Oil diffuses in water. That's a misleading image. Because especially with IT-based innovation, we need to have an active process. People resist change. Infusion implies the activity of making this implementation of a great new idea be deployed, be used. People resist this sort of thing. There's a great Mark Twain line. Mark Twain says, "I love progress. It's change I can't stand." And that's just very human. And that's why the word infusion, I think, fits better here. There's all kinds of advice out there about innovation, all kinds of advice. And in my experience, almost all the advice is good, by which I mean the advice actually is applicable, is useful in some situation. The problem is there's no structure, there's no framework, there's no environment in which to figure out where this bit of advice is valuable and where it might be totally destructive. I want to try to do that with this I3 model. And I believe that to make sense out of this, we have to distinguish between IT creators, organizations that primarily create information technology, like Microsoft, like IBM, like an open source project, and IT users, firms that are primarily users of information technology, insurance companies, banks, government agencies. Yes, I know the big IT vendors also use IT. I also know that sometimes banks, insurance companies, retailers actually create IT. Let's not deal with that for right now. For the most part, there is a pretty clear distinction between those who create IT and those who use IT. Let me ask the room. Who in the room works for a firm that primarily is an IT user? An IT user. Okay, maybe a little more than half of you. Who works for a firm that's primarily an IT creator? Now, the rest of you. Okay, great. So it's probably 60-40, users, creators. In the world at large, of course, there are far more IT user organizations than there are IT creators. But to distinguish between these two groups, I think, is fundamental to understanding how IT innovation works and thus to getting more of it. Because both of them have their own I3 process distinct from the other, and the two I3 processes are connected. It looks like this. The IT creator has an idea which they implement and try to infuse. Think of an example. This is tech ed, so how about SharePoint 2010? Okay, great. The new technology becomes an input to the I3 process of the IT user. That new technology has to go through the same thing, find an idea, get implemented, and infused to create value. I'm going to say more about this in a couple of minutes, but the key point here to make, there are two of them. One is, there are two distinct I3 processes, and the kind of things that are good advice for, let's say, the idea phase of an IT creator are often quite different from things that are useful in, let's say, the implementation phase of an IT user. This is why I think it's so important to have some structure for this. I was talking with a publisher a little while ago about writing a book on this topic. I said on IT innovation. It was a publisher of technology books. And it was clear after a few minutes, I actually asked him to make sure, that his conception of this book was entirely in the upper left of that diagram. They were a technology publisher, and so their notion of IT innovation was solely in the idea implementation phase of an IT creator. Had I been talking to a publisher like Harvard Business School Press, who publishes business books, about an IT innovation book, they would have been thinking about the idea implementation infusion phase of the bottom process. These are different. They differ, as we'll see, in important ways. And it's critical, I think, that we understand and honor that difference. It's also critical, the second point, that we realize the whole goal of this entire process is that green bubble on the far right. The whole goal is business value. IT itself, well, it can be deeply interesting. I certainly think you do too, I'm sure. Does not intrinsically bring value. It brings value when there is change in how we do things. That green circle. Now, just to be clear, I'm not really talking here about the kind of IT that produces consumer products. I'm focused on IT that is used by businesses. This same kind of analysis, this same framework, can work, I believe, with some changes for consumer products. That's not my focus here. I'm focused on IT selling to business and business using IT. That's, I think, where the real massive interest is right now in IT innovation. So just to be clear, that's where I'm focused, that's where I'm coming from, and that's why that last statement is true for the world I'm interested in. Turns out that the idea phase and the implementation phase are easy to understand conceptually. Infusion is harder. Infusion for an IT creator means this. It means getting your technology through the I3 process in as many IT users as possible. That's what it means. Put more bluntly, infusion means sales and marketing. The show floor, the tech ed show floor, is all about innovation. It's about the infusion process of innovation. Those young women in short skirts are part of the innovation process. They really are. They really are. They're doing infusion. Those annoying sales guys who bother you sometimes, I'm sorry. They're really important. They're part of the infusion process. Without infusion, there is no value. Without value, there is no innovation. When I've walked through this discussion with CIOs in end user organizations, one thing they say to me is, well, wait a minute. We don't have any infusion. I understand, they say, what infusion means for vendors. It means selling me stuff. But in my organization, we don't have an infusion step, but I got to tell you, that's wrong. And to explain what infusion means in an IT user, I've got to first give you a simple model of an IT user. A really simple model. Here's an IT user, your organization, let's say, if you work for one of these. You've got some customers. You've got business processes, processes that do things. Those help you produce the products and services that you provide to your customers. That's my simple model, incredibly simple model, of an IT user. Given that simple model, I can explain to you what infusion means. Infusion, in the case of an IT user, means this. It means that the IT user takes a new technology idea from an IT creator, Microsoft, pick your favorite, okay? As I said before, that new technology becomes input to the I3 process of the IT user. Does the technology itself have value to the user? No. No, never. The technology itself has value only when combined with a business change. Technology is important because it lets users create better business processes, because it lets them create new products and services. That's the point. And that is the infusion part of the IT user's story. If you implement, let's say you're an insurance company, and you implement a new process for claims handling using workflow in SharePoint 2010. Will all of your employees adopt that with no training, with no coercion, with no convincing? If so, I want to come work for your company. Because most firms aren't like that. That's infusion for a better business process. If you create a better product, well, gee, do you think your product doesn't require infusion? Of course it does. Infusion is different in IT creators and IT users, but it's there in both. Similarly, the idea part is different in creators and users. In users, the idea part is totally about taking a technology, whether brand new or existing, and combining it with a business idea, a business change. Then you implement that and infuse that. Do you see? This is a big part of why I believe it is so important to think about creators and users differently. Because the kind of things that creators want to do in the idea phase and those that users have to do, they're different. The infusion aspects are different of the two. But they're all part of innovation. They're all part of turning cool new technology ideas into business value down at the bottom of the process. Let me just amplify this last point a little bit. Creating value with IT. Value comes from technology change plus business change. And there are endless examples of this. Let me give you some. One of my favorites is Google Search. As you may know, Google Search got its start with a really cool technology idea, an algorithm called PageRank, invented by Larry Page, one of Google's founders, that was a better way to organize the rankings of search results. That was the technology foundation of Google. Was that enough? Not even close. Because what happened? What happened was in the late 90s, Larry and Sergey had their company Google down there in Silicon Valley. They had this very cool technology for much better search, and they tried to sell it to AOL, to Yahoo. And what did Yahoo and AOL say? They said, well, okay, we admit that your search technology is much better than the search we currently offer on our home pages. But they said, we're trying to build a web portal, a web environment where users come and stay and look at our banner ads and read our content. We do not want better search. If users find what they want through our search, they'll leave our site. It's better for us to have a crappy search. Then they don't find things and they stay where we are. And the Google guys said, whoa, what a surprise that this wonderful new technology just didn't have any value. Until they combined it with a business change. An idea which, by the way, they didn't have. They borrowed from another firm. That firm sued them. Google eventually bought the firm. Great way to end a lawsuit. Buy the other guys. Okay. What was that change? That change was the idea of selling, auctioning search terms. It was that business change that made Google the master it is today, that made that beautiful business that Microsoft so wants to have a bigger and bigger role in. It's a great business. The point is, the technology change wasn't near enough. The business change was fundamental to really creating innovation, value. And the same thing is true in so many scenarios. Think about Amazon. The technology change, of course, web technology. When Tim Berners-Lee was inventing web technology, the core stuff, did he think it would eventually lead to the kind of thing Amazon does? Not at all. Not at all. Because Amazon combined that, Jeff Bezos combined that long ago with the notion of business processes to do retailing on the web. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. I live in Berkeley, California, outside San Francisco. As you might know, Berkeley is the home of the main University of California campus. And so Berkeley has long been a great bookstore town. Like I'm sure many of you, I'm a huge bookstore fan. You a big bookstore fan? Anybody? Yeah, we love bookstores, right? Except in Berkeley, almost all the bookstores are closed. Or they're all in the process of closing. And the reason is me. It's Amazon. I buy from Amazon all the time. And I feel guilty about it. Because I want bookstores to stay alive. But nonetheless, that's what happens. The business change was critical here. There are lots more examples. Think of offshore software development. I know people who think not innovation because it damages your jobs. But on a global scale, it is for sure an innovation. It provides value. The technology change, I would argue, was cheap fiber networks. The business change was the creation of distributed development processes that actually work across time zones and far-flung geographies. The big point here is innovation with IT is always about technology change combined with business change. And so when you think about this, imagine all the ideas you might have in your organization. Of all of those ideas, you could implement only a subset. Of those you implement, you may well infuse a subset of those. As my diagram suggests, you're probably going to infuse most of what you bother to implement. But you surely cannot implement every idea you have. And so what you have to do here is have decision points. Let's call this one D1, where you decide which ideas are worth implementing. Let's call the other one D2, where you decide which implementations are worth infusing. Do organizations make those decisions explicitly, clearly, bluntly? Some do. Many do not. The process of making those decisions, I would argue, is really important to your company because it determines exactly how you use innovation and what value you get from innovation. And there's something remarkable happening here, which is that at the D1 point, we are seeing a whole new way of making that decision. Many, many firms, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, are providing new things on the web. Well, on the web, you can often do experiments. You can do experiments. You can show some customers this option, some that option. You can do experiments and thus figure out which innovation, which idea, which way to go. Google, in fact, had a famous case where one of their graphic designers quit because he said, people at Google don't want my input. They make all these decisions about green or red, circles or squares, based on experiments with their customers, not my expert graphic designer input. The notion here is that IT not only underlies innovation, in fact, at that D1 point, information technology is changing how we do innovation. It makes it much more possible for us to have better decisions about which ideas we ought to implement and then infuse. If you're thinking, this is a very abstract talk, well, you're right. It's the architecture track. What'd you expect, right? So we're going to get a bit more concrete later on, but not too much more concrete. It's the architecture track. So, all right. My next topic, incremental and conceptual innovation. To talk about this, and I think it's important again because when people discuss innovation, when they give you advice for innovation, almost every time in my experience, they just don't distinguish between whether the advice is useful if you want to make small incremental changes or you're looking for bigger shifts. Because as I'll show you in a moment, the reality is those are very different things. And the way, the things you do, the behaviors you engage in to do one are quite distinct from those for doing the other. To talk about this, though, I have to first provide a simple model of technology. And here's my simple model. Users have some task they want done. They want to create a document. They want to watch a movie. They want to, in an insurance company, handle a claim. There's some task users want to do. A technology can support that task. The technology consists of some number of components hooked together in an architecture. There's an overall architecture that knits components together into a cohesive, usable whole to address that task. Great. What's an example? Well, a really common example that we all know is web technology. The original task of web technology, the thing that Sir Tim Berners-Lee was focused on, was document access. It's called Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It was document access. And so the initial components, web browser, HTTP, HTML, the web server, and of course the document, were an architecture to address that task. That, I would argue, was a really important change. And what's happened since then? What's happened since then is we've seen components added to allow other kinds of tasks to be addressed, such as building applications with CGI, ASP.NET, such as much better user interfaces with JavaScript, with Silverlight, with Flash. And now the web can be used for all kinds of tasks, not just documents, but online retailing, video on demand, this whole range of things, which were all added with components built into the original architecture. From this perspective, it is possible to think about the scale of incremental to conceptual innovation. Incremental innovation means improving the components in your existing architecture. Like, for example, HTML5. What does it add? A number of things, one of which is video. Great. It's an improvement to the component we have in the web architecture. SharePoint 2010 has a bunch of improvements to the components of the overall SharePoint architecture. Great. Those innovations are at the left side of my scale here. Contrast that with conceptual innovation. Conceptual innovation, things way at the right, consists, I would argue, of new architectures for addressing current or possibly wholly new tasks that users want to do, like, well, the web. The whole idea of web technology was a new architecture. Or, another example, think of word processing software. In an era of typewriters, there were people improving typewriters right and left, making them better and better. But the notion of applying computers, these million-dollar machines, to building documents, what? That was a whole new architecture for a task we wanted to do. There are many more examples. Here's one from IT users. ATMs. ATMs were a conceptual innovation, over there on the right, to which we're now seeing added many assorted incremental innovations, like now ATMs accept deposits with no envelope. That's an incremental innovation tacked on top of the conceptual innovation. That is so common. That is so common. There's a big conceptual leap defining a new architecture. We then have those components that get improved, HTML5, get added to depositing checks without envelopes. The architectural jumps are on the right. Incremental jumps are more to the left. Given this perspective, how do we get more of each one? Well, here's some suggestions. For incremental innovation, you want to understand the solution very well. Incremental innovation is trying to add new components or improve components in an existing architecture. So the guys at HTML5, for example, they're really good at knowing what HTML does, how to add to it. Great, great. That's really important. You grasp the solution. You observe how it's used. One of the tenets you often hear about innovation is innovation begins with an I, by which they mean an I. They mean observation. And they're right. They're right if what you want is incremental innovation. That's really good if you're trying to create small improvements in the components, even big improvements, in the components of an existing architecture. Here's what it feels like to me. I began my career, my working life as a musician. And one thing I did was play piano for dance classes. When you play for dance classes, here's how it works. You're at the piano, and the dance teacher says, David, I need something bouncy in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you start playing something bouncy in 4. You got to make it up. You're improvising. You got to make it up. Okay. Sometimes she'll say something bouncy in 4. You start playing, and she'll stop you. She'll say, David, no. I don't like that. Something else bouncy in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you do something else bouncy in 4. You do not have time to think. You're improvising music on the spot. When I first began doing this, I was just terrible. I couldn't do it. It turned out that it takes a bunch of time to get up to be able to do that. And once you're doing it, it's remarkable because it's as if the ideas are in your hands. You're playing, and I'd find my mind going, oh, hands. Good job, hands. Pretty cool. Or sometimes I'd be saying, hands, that sucks. You can do better than that. Come on. But it feels like the ideas are in your hands, okay? That's incremental innovation. The ideas are in your hands. You know the space so well that you know how to make progress. That's not conceptual innovation. My skills, such as they were, at improvising for dance classes would never have led me to invent, say, hip-hop, right? Never would have gotten there. That kind of conceptual shift requires something else. I would suggest to you that for conceptual innovation, you think not about the current solution, but about the problem space. Think about typewriters again and word processing software. IBM had this wonderful selector typewriter, little balls spun around. Okay, great. If I'm the guy who knows inside and out how that typewriter works, and I've optimized and improved this piece, am I the guy who's ever going to create word processing software? The answer is almost certainly not. That comes from a whole different perspective of people who grasp the problem, creating documents, and have the broad perspective for a whole different architecture to address that problem. And there's another issue as well. The issue is this. The issue is that we know incremental innovation is so much easier than conceptual innovation. Why? Why? Well, obviously, it's because it's easier to see what's wrong with current solutions. You can work with, identify the current problems. You can say, you know, HTML doesn't do video. Let's change that. You can say SharePoint doesn't provide a good platform for development. Let's change that in 2010. You know what you're doing. But also, critically important, you have in place the right implementation and infusion processes for the new ideas. SharePoint 2010 gets sold to you how? Through the usual way. It gets built, Microsoft's usual process. HTML5 gets you video how? Through web browsers. The last two I's are in place. For conceptual innovations, it's really hard, in part because they're hard to see. They're really hard to see. It's difficult to invent a whole new architecture, maybe with new components, to solve a problem. It's difficult. But also, even if you do it in an organization, you might have the first I part all down. You got great new ideas, great new architectures, great new concepts. But the implementation and diffusion are just all wrong. Xerox, once again, is a killer example. Xerox invented the GUI, right? Xerox moved to a paperless office. They built the Star workstation, not exactly the best implementation, but workable. And they tried to sell this through a sales force that knew how to sell copiers. Their infusion process was totally hosed. So it's not just hard to have conceptual ideas or to implement them. It's also brutally hard to infuse them, especially inside organizations. You ever wonder why big firms are really good at incremental innovation and really bad at conceptual innovation? This is part of it. Because the great ideas just can't get out into the world. The firm's implementation and infusion processes are designed for what they already have, not these big new shifts. IBM, who led in typewriters, never became a huge player in word processing software. Those shifts are very hard to make. All right. So let's talk more about encouraging innovation. First, IT users. My chart here defines a little space. The vertical axis is how much competitive advantage a given innovation brings to an organization like your firm. The horizontal is time. So the first company in an industry to implement some innovation can get enormous competitive advantage. Think about the first gas station to have pay at the pump, or the first airline to have check-in kiosks, or the first shipping company to offer web-based package tracking. Those all provided competitive advantage. But then what happened? Innovations are hard to keep secret. And so the next firm in the industry implements the same innovation. Do they get competitive advantage? Sure, sure. As much as the first firm? Probably not. How about the third firm to do this? What do they get? Well, they don't get too much, probably, because what's happening here is the value of the innovation, competitive advantage, asymptotically approaches zero. And the reason for that is that what begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. Let me say that again. What begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. Today, an airline without check-in kiosks, a package firm without web-based tracking, A gas station I'll pay at the pump, you're toast. What starts as advantages becomes things you have to do. So, let's think about that. For providing business value, there is this window of differentiation. As an IT user organization, if you're in that space with some IT-based innovation, you can get real competitive advantage, real strategic advantage. And so this, I think, lets us think about the kinds of innovation strategies that firms use. If you want to be the leader way up there, then you better be good at all three I's. You better be good at having ideas, at implementing them, at infusing them. Being the leader requires being good at all three. You might alternatively choose to be what's often called a fast follower. Fast followers don't really need to be great at ideas, but they do need to be great at implementation and infusion. You know, thinking about technology companies, anybody think of a firm that is pretty darn good at that second strategy there, that has made a great deal of money at that second strategy there? Anybody come to mind? You know? Yeah, I mean, Microsoft is often dinged for not being an innovator. And I would suggest to you that this criticism stems from a mistaken notion of what innovation means. Innovation is not ideas. Innovation is all three I's. Microsoft certainly is an innovator. They have some ideas themselves, clearly, but they're really, really good at the last two I's. You know, you might call that fast follower, you might call that the second mouse strategy, because the story goes that it's the second mouse that gets the cheese, the first mouse dies in the trap. Then there's the laggard. If you're a laggard, a straggler, ignore the I's. Weaken all three of them. Who cares? It's fine. That's fine. If you're a straggler, you're going to do things when they become obligations. Once they're out of that window of differentiation. Does that make sense? Sure. Sure, because organizations will pursue different points on that curve for different parts of their business. If you're a manufacturing firm, is it okay to be a straggler in how you do payroll? Probably. But do you want to be a straggler in how you actually do your manufacturing processes? I would bet not. So, companies have to choose what strategy they want in different parts of their business. I'm going to talk more about that, but first, let's discuss the importance of copying. Because this gets hidden, and it gets hidden in part because we so emphasize the idea phase of innovation. But the reality is this. The reality is that being good at copying your competitors is really important. Because I don't care who you are, I don't care what industry you're in, most good ideas will not come from you. And so, you will not be the first firm on that curve most of the time. But as many examples have shown, e.g. the size of this conference, being the second mouse can be a tremendous strategy. And whether you want it to be or not, you often will find yourself in the role of second mouse. There's no way around it. So being good at copying is important. It's really important. It requires that you have the right processes in place. For IT-based innovation, that tends to mean a good understanding of the importance and the process of building custom apps. If you care about this, my next talk, the next session after this, a different room, is all about that topic. It also requires a culture that can accept intelligent risk. I was in Brussels last month, where I met with some people that provide services for banks. They're a big organization that provides banking services. The company's motto is failure is not an option. Can that firm innovate? I wonder. Cultures that can't accept intelligent risk have a really tough time with innovation. Because innovations fail, sometimes. And finally, you gotta have the right people. If you want to be a copier, at the very least, you need good people for the second two I's. In fact, the story is stronger than this. The story really is that you need the right kinds of people for each of the phases, and how strong they have to be depends on your overall innovation strategy. So, for example, if you want to be good at the first I, at ideas, well, you want people who I want to call strategic. People who have business knowledge, IT knowledge. Remember, we're talking about IT users here, not the vendors, IT users, manufacturing firms, retailers, banks, and so on. People who understand your business and can grasp the technology and are creative enough to combine those two in ways that have value. That's a skill set. That's a personality type. That's a role. It's a job. And it's quite distinct from the kinds of skills you need in people in the second I. Implementation requires what I want to call transformational people. People who are really good at, say, building custom apps, because so much of IT-based innovation hinges on custom apps. Transformational people need not be all that creative or business knowledgeable, at least in that sense. What they've got to be good at is execution, at making this transformation happen from idea to actual thing. And then, phase 3 at IT users, infusion. It's really there. Those people, let's call them persuasive. They've got to know the user base well, have good communication skills. And one more thing. To get value requires that this IT-based innovation, having gone through the I3 process, actually run successfully. Well, what does that require? It requires operations people with the right operational skills. It's important as well for this IT-based innovation story to be successful. How strong you want to be in each category depends on what your strategy is, what point you want to be at in that curve I showed you earlier. The inescapable implication of that last picture is that to do IT-based innovation in IT users requires us to work with them. It requires IT people to work with business people. Anybody work for a firm where this interaction is smooth and easy and no problem at all? If anybody raises your hand, you are lying, right? Because the truth, you know the truth, is that we and they, we're different cultures. They laugh at golf jokes. We laugh at Star Trek jokes. We're just different cultures. They often think that we dress badly and take too few showers. I don't know. You know, it's hard. It's hard. But there is this truth that I feel obliged to remind you of. The truth is this. The truth is that we work for them. The truth is that they pay us. I told you I was a musician in an earlier life. You know, the work I do now is like being a musician. I travel around, I perform for groups. The big difference is I now stay in much better hotels. It's good. But if you've heard the story before, bear with me, please. When I was a musician, one thing I did was play keyboards in a band, in a funk band. We played in clubs. Club is a nice word for bar. When you play in a club and you start doing this kind of work, you think, I'm an artist. You think that the quality of my solos and the beauty of how I back the singers, that's what really matters here. I'm an artist. And you get disabused of this notion pretty darn fast. Because the truth is that the only thing that matters to the club owner, the only thing that determines whether or not he or she hires you again, is how many drinks the club sells the night you play. I thought I was an artist. I was, in fact, a liquor salesman. I'd like to suggest that the analogy here is evident, is it not? We are liquor salesmen. And there is no shame in that. There's no shame at all. But we're not artists. We're here to bring value to the business. You know, it's kind of a strange analogy for me because when people work in the music world, you live in a world that's just suffused with drugs and alcohol. You come out of that world either an alcoholic or a teetotaler. I don't even drink. So the liquor salesman thing is an odd metaphor for me. But nonetheless, I think it's useful for us to remember this. I really do. Finally here, the last point about IT users. You need to measure value. You really need to measure the value you provide. And that value has got to be measured by business people because the value is business value. And those people have got to be outside the group that did the project. In so many organizations, this step is not done. In so many organizations, nobody concretely, explicitly, fairly tries to measure the value created by some IT project that was supposed to be innovative and have business value. But if you don't do this, then you don't know how well you're doing, and it's very hard to get funded, to get credibility for the next time you want to do it. So I would encourage you that to really get innovation, IT-based innovation, in IT user organizations, measuring the value of what you create honestly, fairly, is fundamentally important. It's the way you get evidence to do more innovation. It's the way you know that you're doing the right thing. All right, IT creators, my last section here. Why did I start by talking about IT users? The reason is that I would argue with all of my heart that IT creators really need to understand how users innovate. Because in my experience, in so many cases, they don't. They don't think about the process their cool new technology will have to go through at some IT users. The reality is, you've got to grasp this to create technologies in your world that will be successful in that second and related I3 process. The link between the idea in the IT creator's mind, up in the upper left of my earlier picture, and the green bubble in the right, can sometimes be really, really strong. Startups are incredibly tightly linked between my idea and business value. They have to be, or they crash and burn. In big technology companies, however, it's so hard. The guys in the idea part of the I3 process in a big technology company are often so far removed from the users and business value, they have no visibility into that world. I believe this is a big part of why big technology companies are not strong at the kinds of conceptual innovations that startups routinely create. A huge part of it is that startups are so close to business value in a way that the people in giant technology firms at the first I phase of their I3 process are not. When you evaluate technology ideas in the IT creator world, what are the criteria? What's important? I would argue that what's important is this. What's important is how many new business ideas your technology can combine with in how many IT users. Because remember, new IT is valueless. New IT plus business change, can be the start of the IT user's I3 process creating value. So, a technology's importance, at least in the sense I mean it here, is solely about how many new business ideas, business changes, business improvements it can create in as many IT users as possible. Here are some examples. Of course, example number one, as always, web technology. Web technology combines with all kinds of business ideas in all kinds of companies. There's an excellent reason why web technology was number one on the Wharton list, because it is the most important innovation by a mile the last 30 years. How about search? I would argue search is also important. Search is a technology that combined with one idea, auctioning search terms, advertising based on search, one idea. But that idea applies to jillions of companies. It's an important thing. What about workflow engines? We're getting geekier here. Maybe some of you have read some of the papers I've written on Windows Workflow Foundation. WF is a very cool technology. I love WF. How important is WF commercially? The answer is, I would say moderately. It has combined with some business ideas in some firms. Hence, it is nowhere near as important as search technology, as web technology, as SharePoint, which is a whole bunch of stuff. And how about an example of a technology that is not very important? I'm now going to make somebody in the room really angry. So prepare yourselves, okay? I would argue that an example of a technology that is simply not very important in the sense I mean, the commercial value sense, is functional languages. Lisp, F#. I'm sorry, F# fans. If you're in the room, Don, forgive me, right? Functional languages have been here for 50 years, and they have yet to really combine with many business ideas in a unique way, a way you could not address with, say, C#. So, cool technology, way cool technology, arguably not very important in the sense I mean important. As an innovation, I would not rate them very high by the value structure I'm using in this presentation. So if you're an IT creator, we know you can do incremental innovation. IT creators are good at this. They're big firms. How do you get more conceptual innovation? How do you get more of these big value innovations? I would suggest that a way to think about this is to create, to inculcate what I want to call startup mind in your organization. As I said earlier, startups have a really clear connection between new technology and business value, a really clear connection. That's important. Startups also are not bound by the usual constraints of the space they're in. That is, startups are not focusing on trying to improve the components in existing architecture. They're prospecting for new architectures for new problems or existing problems, like, for example, in word processing software. Who did that? Wang did that back in the 80s, whole new company. A new architecture for an existing problem. Think about Twitter. A new architecture for a whole new problem. Nobody knew we wanted to tweet until we could, and then we all want to tweet all the time. Okay, that's amazing. Those kinds of ideas are not in any way incremental. They're new architectures, in that case, for a whole new problem. Didn't even know we had. Startup people are tolerant of failure. They do not face career destruction if an idea fails. This is really important as well. I live outside San Francisco, Silicon Valley area. Where I live, everybody is a veteran of at least one failed startup. It's not a bad thing at all. It's a badge of honor, of course. But I was in Bangalore, in India, a little while ago, talking to a guy who runs a startup in India. He told me something amazing. He said that in India, where arranged marriage is still an important part of the culture, he said that if you run a startup, your prospective spouse's parents will write you off as a possible partner. You're far too risky. It's hard to get married if you run a startup. I said, well, you're married. How did you do it? He said, I got married first. So, honestly, the notion of having your career be destroyed if your idea fails is just inimical to startups. It stops them dead. I was in Tel Aviv last month. Jeez. Israel's amazing. Startup nation. It's a culture designed for startups. Israel has more startups per capita than anybody in the world. They're astonishing. They are the living embodiment of startup mind across their people. And also, there are clear and direct incentives for success with startups, usually in the form of stock options. the chance of getting really rich is pretty attractive to even geeks, lots of us. That last point is important as well, incentives. Because the incentives for IT creators are difficult to do correctly. In lots of IT creators, the incentives are really distorted, especially in big companies. Because in big firms, what can matter to the idea people, implementation people, and product groups is not the ultimate business value far at the other end. They can't even see that. What they can see is their peers, people they work with. And so the respect of your peers, technical coolness, becomes the big incentive, the big driver. This is not a good way to create ideas that lead to implementations that can be infused effectively into the I3 processes of end users and create business value. Not a good approach. So what's a better approach? Well, you'd like to have some way to connect the IT creators to business value, because the customers, as my slide says, care about their problems, not your technology. But how do you do that? The answer is, well, it's hard. When you think about measuring IT value, IT creators try to do this in a variety of ways. They measure patents. But patents are really what? They're a measure of where you are at the end of the idea phase. It's an input. Or they measure their R&D spending. Well, R&D spending is also a measure of an input. I would argue that if they're real measures of innovation, they should include their marketing spend in there, because infusion is a big part of innovation. The real thing that firms most often use is some connection to profit, because profit is a proxy for IT user value. And so people get stock options. So the share goes up, they make more money. But it's hard. It's just frankly hard in big firms to connect IT creators, at the start here especially, with actual user value at the end. I'm almost done. Just some final thoughts here. A reprise of the list I began with. The top 10 innovations in the last 30 years. They're all about IT. Think what that means. Innovation is what drives the world forward. Innovation is what makes the world a better place. And all of these changes are based on IT. The reality, I think, is this. The reality is that every era has some defining technology. In 1800, it was steam power. In 1880, it was electricity. Early 20th century, it was automobiles, internal combustion engines. What is it today? You know, it's IT. Innovators in an era's defining technology are the people who create the future. Do you ever feel like you're just writing one more piece of code, testing one more app, trying to sell somebody some extra piece of software, supporting some app that was built who knows when, fixing some email problem? Do you ever feel like that? You should not. You should realize that you work in IT. And we in IT are the people who drive the world forward. The reality, I believe with all my heart, is this. The reality is we work in the most important profession in the world. Thank you.